Good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to be here and get to talk to you about solid-phase microextraction today. As Matt mentioned, my name is Colton Myers. I'm an R&D manager within sample preparation at ResTech, and a lot of my experience in the laboratory has been around building sample prep applications and also gaining a better understanding of how we can efficiently employ this technique into our laboratories. So with that, let's dive into the material. Just a quick note on the agenda for today. I'll briefly be going over solid phase microextraction and giving an overview of the technology, dive into the method development and the critical parameters that we need to optimize, and then finally showing you some application work that we've done in the food and environmental sectors. So first, let's start out by looking at, the different microextraction devices that have been seen on the market, right, and exist in the marketplace. So there's stir-bar, sorptive extraction, ITEX or in-tube extraction, and then thin film SPME, along with both the traditional SPME fibers as well as the SPME arrows. Now, all these devices can really help you, mitigate matrix effect or maybe improve the sensitivity of your analytes by offering that much better selectivity. What I personally like about the SPME fibers and the SPME arrows is that I find that these are much easier to automate on your instrument tops, especially when looking to build high throughput methods, right? So we can just increase our sample throughput. What I also like about microextraction devices, especially the SPME fibers and SPME arrows, is that we can really apply these to almost every market, right? And looking at many different complex samples, as well as many different classes of analytes. So some really common places that this technology exists, if you're unfamiliar with it, is the food area and food safety, right? We can do both aroma profiling or flavor profiling of different foods. We can also look at compounds in the food safety area like pesticides, and then also in environmental, this has been heavily used for analyses, for water analysis, whether it's semi-volatiles or volatiles. So, but really, this technology can be applied in many different spaces, which makes it so versatile. So why would we want to approach SPME and to potentially use this within our laboratories? Well, one, it offers simplification, right? So solid phase microextraction is a great technique that offers both the sample extraction or sample preparation, as well as the sample introduction into our GC inlet into one device, right? So everything has been integrated into one device. You don't need multiple devices like SPE cartridges or anything else to then move to, a liquid injection on your GC. The next nice feature about SPME is that it is considered a green technology. So we can run headspace off of solid samples, liquid samples. We can directly immerse this into liquid samples, and it also does not require the high volume of solvent usage that is typically used in large liquid extractions or through techniques like SPE. And then finally, as I mentioned, another reason why you would want to pursue SPME is that it can be fully automated on your instrument top, giving you much better throughput, and fully automating SPME will also make your methods much more reproducible compared to manual mode. So for those of you, again, who might not be as familiar with the technique, let me get my pointer off. Oh, this doesn't seem to be working. Okay, so I apologize for that. Let me see. Okay, I apologize for this. For headspace analysis, this should be playing a video where you can see the the SPME arrow coming into the headspace of the vial. You can see our liquid in the bottom here, and this vial will be brought to equilibrium. The fiber or arrow will be exposed to the headspace for a set extraction time, and then it will be removed and then directly go to our GC inlet. And again, this could be done on a solid or liquid sample. So then for direct immersion, we would have a vial that is completely full, or we would directly immerse the vial with the liquid in it, bring it to equilibrium, directly immerse the arrow into the vial, and run our extraction. Now, the main reason why you would want to use headspace is for your volatile constituents, and direct immersion really comes in handy if you're looking for less volatile constituents where they might not readily as move to the headspace if you were to use that type of method. So then looking at the SPME fiber versus the SPME arrow, I've mentioned both of these devices. You can see the greatest difference in these boxes that are highlighted, right? So the black area on the fiber, right, and the black area on the arrow, that's our carbon wide range coating. And you can see that the volume of coating is much greater, which I'll get into in a little bit, but also the arrow offers some nice unique features, which I'll also get into, that provide much better mechanical robustness for your analyses. Now, also in the market recently, you've probably seen a shift, right? There's now non-smart devices as well as smart devices. And our non-smart devices, they only consist of SPME fibers, and these are compatible with PAL 3 Series 1 and older, right? So if you have a PAL 3 Series 2, unfortunately, non-smart devices cannot be used on this type of rail system. And then for smart devices, we only offer SPME arrows in the smart device or in the smart option. Fibers are also available in the smart option. However, you do not need a smart SPME fiber if you are using a PAL XT or PAL 3 Series 1, as I mentioned above. And for those of you who are new to this technology, the smart device is made smart by having this chip in the end of it, which can be read by the auto sampler. And this will allow you to see or to easily identify the phase or the coating that is placed onto the fiber or arrow, and also offers you the number of injections, which can come in handy if you replace your arrows or fibers after a set number of injections. Now, the main differences between the fiber and the arrow, clearly you can see it's by size, right? So here we have a 1.1 millimeter arrow, which is what I'll focus on, and also a SPME fiber. And the noticeable differences are the support tubing, which is this piece, the septum piercing needle, which is the end here, the septum piercing needle, which is the shaft that sits inside the support tubing, and then also the arrow tip, as well as the phase volume differences. And if we look at the phase volume differences in microliters, we get a little over 6 times greater phase volume on a arrow with the same film thickness of coating compared to a traditional fiber. So it offers you much better sensitivity. And to look at the sensitivity differences, here I have a quick graph where we looked at traditional SPME and an extended extraction compared to a SPME arrow with a 2-minute extraction, looking at terpenes in I believe cannabis flower, or just it might be a reference standard, and you can see how the SPME arrow is outperforming the SPME or the traditional SPME fiber, or is very comparable, right, just with a much shorter extraction time. So that's really the advantage of the SPME arrows. You can reach good levels of analyte extraction very quickly compared to that of a traditional SPME fiber. So now let's get into SPME method development and the critical parameters that we need to optimize. Now, this really is a game of balance, right? We have many different parameters, in addition to our chromatographic parameters that we need to optimize to ensure that we have a very effective, efficient, and reproducible extraction on our SPME devices for a given method. So when we look at optimizing parameters, there's a couple things that we want to ask ourselves and some things that we need to consider. First, what are your analytes of interest? What is the sample matrix? Which fiber should you then use? And then also as I mentioned, what are the appropriate SPME conditions, right? So we want to tailor our phase selection to our analytes of interest while also hoping to eliminate some of that background noise from interferences. And then how can we do that, right? In addition to the phase coding, how can we eliminate that noise while also improving the response of our target analytes through our SPME conditions, which include incubation. So this is how long we equilibrate our sample. A preconditioning, what type of fiber are you using and how do you clean that fiber to optimize your analysis? And then how long will we be extracting our analytes, right? And at what temperatures? And then finally, what's the optimal desorption temperature that we need for our GC inlet? And this is going to also play on the phase coding that you're using. And then finally, if you have analyte carryover, do you need a post-conditioning step? So the process that I frequently use whenever I develop a SPME method starts with phase selection, right? I want to first identify a phase under some generic conditions that can help me extract my target analytes, again, hoping to eliminate that background noise of analytes that may be creating interferences. Then I look to optimizing my extraction, right? And for me, this is one of the most important parameters because we need to understand the rate at which our target analytes are being extracted, and this will not be the same for each analyte of interest. And then finally, or not finally, but then we'll move into incubation optimization. So how long does it take for our analytes to move to the headspace or partition into the headspace of our vial? And then finally, evaluating that desorption and carryover for optimal conditions. So as you can see, the way that which these parameters actually take place through through a SPME method, incubation takes place prior to extraction. But I think it's important to note that we should optimize our extraction time prior to incubation optimization, and that's just something that I've learned through making these or building these different methods, which I think could really help you all as you maybe dive into developing some of your own SPME methods. So first we'll get into phase selection. And as you've seen, if you're familiar with the technology, there's many different coatings for SPME fibers, right? We have 3 different types of PDMS, or polydimethylsiloxane, which move from a 7 micron to 100 micron. Now, the main differences between, or why you would want to use a 7 over 100 is the 7 is very good for your higher molecular weight compounds, where the 100 micron is much better for your lower molecular weight compounds. Then for polar analytes, the polyacrylate can be used. This is a polar phase. And then for our highly volatiles, we'll want to use a carbon fiber or carbon wide range coating. For aromatics, you can gain much better sensitivity using a divinyl benzene coating. And then if you're unsure of what you're looking at or maybe doing some untargeted work, I think that the triple phase fiber could be a good option for you there. Now, we also offer many of these same phases for the SPME arrow. What you will notice is different for the SPME arrow is that we don't have each of the unique film thicknesses or coating thicknesses for the polydimethylsiloxane, right? So we don't offer this 7 micron or 30 micron PDMS phase for the Aero. We only offer this in a 100 micron PDMS phase. But with the extra phase volume, that's not much of an issue for the Aero. Now, there are also 2 Aeros available in terms of the needle diameter, and we have a 1.1 millimeter as well as a 1.5 millimeter needle diameter. Now, the 1.1, it can be noted by this red piece of tubing or part on the Aero, and the 1.5 can be noted by the yellow. So these are easily identifiable in the laboratory. And the 1.5 is typically used for direct immersion extractions, whereas the 1.1 is better for headspace. So the 1.5 allows some extra space inside the tubing for phase swelling, so that the phase is not stripped off the Aero after it has extracted analytes from the sample. So looking at phase selection, right, as I mentioned, this is a very critical step in developing your SPME methods. And what I've noticed in the past is that many scientists will use a tri-phase fiber, but the question to ask yourself is, are all 3 phases needed for the method, right? And I have a good example of this later on. Now, less phases can improve some methods, as I'll show. Using just a carbon wide range or divinyl benzene phase instead of a tri-phase can be advantageous because it doesn't collect as much matrix interferences, but you might also have better loading of your analyte for your analytes of interest based on the increased loading of carbon or divinyl benzene. Now, moving into extraction. So when we first look at, once we've identified the phase and we start to optimize our extraction parameters, we do this by evaluating a range of extraction times at different temperatures, right? So each unique setting will be run in triplicate to help determine some reproducibility. So this might look like the following, right? For an analyte class that I'm unfamiliar with, I want to evaluate 3 different extraction temperatures, followed by 4 different times or 3 different times if I'm unfamiliar, with it. You can do, if you're unfamiliar with the analytes of interest and their partitioning, this can look very different, right? But I think this is a good start in evaluating extraction times for each of these given temperatures. And then once you've narrowed in on a extraction time and temperature, you can then move into incubation optimization. So for incubation optimization, we use the optimized extraction temperature, and now we just look at different incubation times, right? Still running in triplicate. So from the last study, if we settled on a 40-degree extraction temperature, we would then look at incubation over the core incubation times at that set temperature. So finally, desorption and carryover optimization. Some considerations that I think you should have. Are your compounds of interest thermally labile? Are they VOCs? Are they SVOCs? Understanding the compound characteristics are really going to help you determine what temperature you need to desorb at and for how long as well. And then a similar approach could be taken to your extraction evaluation, where you look at different temperatures and different desorption times. I will say that when I build SPME methods, I like to try to have a rapid desorption because that leads to less peak tailing. So you get much better peak sharpness or peak symmetry as with a more rapid desorption time and temperature. So I like to use the maximum fiber temperature or phase coating temperature, and typically a 1-minute desorption works for me. But again, that's something that you may need to evaluate as you build your methods. And then for carryover, the first thing you need to do is understand your sample desorption, right? So understanding that sample desorption is going to help in determining the carryover, right? So the first thing you could do is after a sample is injected, you could rerun that fiber or arrow without doing another extraction and assess the analyte or matrix carryover, right? So if I run my fiber, if I extract a sample and I desorb it in the inlet, let that method run through, and then I take that fiber arrow and redesorb it, I can see how much is left over on that fiber arrow. And this really answers the question, do I have complete desorption, right? And if you do have complete desorption, then that's good, right? So you may only need to optimize a preconditioning step. But if you have very dirty samples, you may need to implement a preconditioning and post-conditioning for your method. Now, the other note that I'd like to make on building SPME methods is it's important to understand the calibrations and how SPME calibrations work. So SPME devices, they have a saturation point, right? There's a point at which no more analyte can be extracted by the device and remain on the device. So, when we were looking at bromoform, right? On the bottom we have a analyte, or our analyte concentration, and on the y-axis we have our response factor. So if we look at this extraction, we can see that we get this plateau starting to occur, and this is going to impact our linearity, right, for our calibration. And this is the point at which we say, we've reached an analyte saturation. So it's important that we work within the linear working range of the SPME device at its given temperatures, or at the given extraction conditions. So what we would do here is we would understand where we reach that saturation point depending on the analyte concentration, and we would then know that we need to adjust the concentration range so that we work into the linear working rate. We work within the linear working range of the device for that compound of interest. And this is going to look different for different compounds depending on the extraction efficiencies of that compound by the SPME coating. So next we'll go into some application development and actually using this method and approach for building methods in both the food and environmental areas. So first, for the method that I want to show you is the analysis of furan and alkyl furans in food commodities. So furans and alkyl furans have been recognized for their potential health risks, right? And they occur or are formed during chemical reactions that take place during different heating processes, which might include, sterilization or roasting of different food commodities. Existing methods in this area heavily rely on headspace analysis, but the unfortunate thing with headspace analysis is that this can lead to much longer sampling times, providing laboratories with poorer throughput, right? Especially if there's many samples to get through in this area. Traditional headspace methods can really impact your ability to process many samples. The other issue with headspace analysis is that it can lead to poor selectivity, right? So we're just moving our analytes into a headspace syringe or a headspace loop. There's no real means of selectivity, which can impact our sensitivity for those lower concentration compounds of interest. So SPME offers much better selectivity for these extractions, and can also improve the sample throughput because we know that SPME methods can often work much quicker than traditional headspace methods. And so the two commodities that I'd like to share with you today include both baby formula and furans and alkylfurans in coffee. And what we noticed, just so you know some of the challenges going into this, and I'll touch on this again, is that the baby formula had very low concentrations and the coffee had much higher concentrations of furans and alkylfurans, which did present some challenges when trying to build a method for them. So the first thing that I mentioned, that we need to do when building SPME methods is making sure that we have the right phase coating selected for our analytes of interest, right? So here you can see the compound structures for the furan and alkylfurans of interest. And we looked at 3 different coatings for extracting these analytes. And this includes in blue, a carbon, the carbon wide range, in orange, the divinyl benzene, and then in gray, the triphase. So this includes our carbon wide range, our divinyl benzene, as well as our PDMS. And as I mentioned, many laboratories will just immediately use the triphase fiber, but you can see from this graph that the triphase isn't always the best to use, right? So what is influencing the extraction of these analytes the most is actually the carbon, and the carbon loading is going to be much higher on the wide range carbon compared to the triphase because it has both the carbon and divinyl benzene within the coating. So you can see for extremely volatile constituents, right, which the furan and alkylfurans are, having this additional carbon load helps capture those analytes and improve our sensitivity for these analytes of interest. So once we optimized our SPME phase, we did want to do a quick comparison of how does this measure up to traditional headspace methods. And the headspace method used a headspace syringe, right, on an instrument rail top. So we used we had our set of SPME conditions and we had optimal headspace conditions. And you can see the SPME arrow, again, not only outperforms traditional SPME as we would assume, but it also really outperforms the headspace tool, right? And that selectivity offered by the SPME coating, it does such a good job at capturing these analytes of interest and helps boost our sensitivity for our compounds of interest. So once we identified that the carbon wide range arrow was going to work very well for us, we then moved into assessing the extraction temperature. So you can see how we evaluated the extraction temperature. We looked at 40 degrees Celsius, we looked at 50 and 60 degrees. And you can see from this that the 40 and the 50 were fairly close. Now for 2-pentylfuran, which was of interest, we started to get really into the noise with this at each temperature actually. But later in the method, you'll see that we actually moved with the 50. I know it looks like we have poor reproducibility here, but we reevaluated this later on to ensure that this temperature would offer us the reproducibility that we need. And again, you'll see that later on. So after we looked at the temperature, we also evaluated extraction times, right? And here you can see the extraction graphs for each analyte of interest. So on the y-axis, we have our area counts, and on the x-axis, we have our extraction time in minutes. And you can see that for furan, we reach our optimal or we reach a saturation point for furan very quickly, whereas for 3-methylfuran, it takes us a little bit longer to reach that full saturation or full extraction for this compound, right? So this is really, as I mentioned, a game of balance in developing these methods. So again, some sample challenges that we faced for these different matrices. One, again, the SPME fiber, the baby formula had compound concentrations that were much lower levels compared to the coffee, right? And the lower concentrations required longer extraction times, which you'll see in a second. And also because of those lower concentrations within sample, we had to use a 10 mil sample size, which also helped us concentrate the analytes in those heads in the headspace vial. I'll commonly use 5 mils of sample size, a 5 mil sample size, because we typically do have enough sensitivity, but to help concentrate the headspace and promote better extraction, we used a 10 mil sample size. And then for the coffee, right, we had compound concentrations at much higher levels. So this required shorter extraction times, right? So we didn't oversaturate the arrow and could remain in a good linear working range for our calibrations. And then we also used a 5 mil sample size for this analysis to help dilute the headspace a little bit because our samples were much higher in concentrations. So look at our final sampling parameters, right? We used half a gram of sample, so half a gram of baby formula or coffee, followed by 10 mil addition of 30% sodium chloride in water solution. The 30% sodium chloride really helps promote these analytes of interest into the headspace. It makes them less soluble in the water matrix and in the baby formula matrix, and promoting them to the headspace. For coffee, we used a 5 mil addition of this 30% sodium chloride solution. And then we also had the use of an internal standard. Our incubation time, once it was evaluated, was set to 10 minutes. Again, using a 50 degrees Celsius extraction and incubation temperature. And then, as mentioned, we had a much longer extraction time for baby formula due to the low concentrations compared to that for coffee, where we could use a much shorter extraction time for this method. And then our desorption was at the fiber maximum temperature, or the phase coating maximum temperature, and was a 1 minute desorption. We had much different calibrations, right? So we had a low concentration calibration curve as well as a high concentration calibration curve. Our low calibration curve resulted in a 1.25 nanogram all the way up to 150 nanograms of analyte in vial, while our higher concentration started at 25 nanograms in vial and went all the way to 8,000 nanograms. And then in looking at the low concentration calibration, you can see that using the parameters for the baby formula, we were able to achieve great linearity for each of our compounds of interest, achieving 3 nines for half of the compounds, and then 2 nines and almost 3 nines for the compounds on the bottom. So you can see that we were able to achieve very good linearity across these calibration ranges. So some final results in assessing the baby formula and looking at our method verification to ensure that this method could give us the accuracy and recoveries that we needed. You can see that our method accuracy for each analyte on the low concentration end. So we did two spikes to evaluate these percent recoveries and their accuracy. We did a low concentration spike at 5 micrograms per kilogram and a high concentration spike at 50 micrograms per kilogram to ensure that we had good accuracy at both the low end and the high end of our calibration range. For the low end, we did have one compound out of our 80 to 110 spec that we set for this method, but otherwise it's still, each of these compounds does fall within the percent accuracy needs for this method. And then on the high end, we were able to achieve that 80 to 110 percent accuracy for these analytes of interest. And then I also want to note that we have very good reproducibility for each of these compounds at each spike level, showing that the method could work and be used very well for this analysis. And then for our high concentration calibration for the coffee, you can see again that we achieved very good linearity for each compound of interest. And we were working within the linear range of the fiber at the conditions that we were using for the coffee, which the main difference again being that 1 minute extraction versus the 10-minute extraction that was used for the baby formula. And in looking at our low concentration spike versus our high concentration spike for the coffee samples, sorry, this should be 25 micrograms per kilogram all the way out to 8,000 micrograms per kilogram. But our accuracy falls well within the limits that we set. We have excellent reproducibility for our low concentration spikes. And unfortunately, the high concentration spikes did fall a little bit out of spec, but these are still very close to our needs to our recovery needs and accuracy needs for this method. They also did show very good reproducibility, which leads us to believe that this method is very good for analyzing furans and alkyl furans in coffee. Now, some summary of this work, right? SPME proved to be a more effective sample preparation approach compared to a traditional headspace approach, and this is really due to the selectivity of the phase coding, which allowed for significantly better extraction efficiencies. We did have to use 2 different calibrations under 2 different sets of conditions to analyze each of these different matrices. So that's something to keep in mind if you do have matrices with higher concentrations of analytes and lower concentrations of analytes. You may need to have 2 different sampling methods, but that's very easy to do. The other option would be to dilute your samples down depending on the recoveries that you're seeing in your samples. For our baby formula results, we were able to achieve the recoveries for our low spikes between 80 and 110%, with the exception of 3-methylfuran, which was just outside of that. And then for our coffee results, we were able to achieve recoveries for our low spikes between 80 to 110%. Unfortunately, there was some bias seen on the high end, with recoveries reaching out to 125%. Now, the next method that I want to quickly go over is a recent application development, which is the determination of volatile organic compounds and odors in drinking water. So these are two separate headspace methods, or were 2 different headspace methods using 2 different GC columns. And the idea here was, can we bring each of these methods, combine them into one on one GC phase, and then also use SPME as an effective extraction and sample introduction device. So each of these compound classes, the VOCs and the odors, had very different levels of detection, which we thought might be a big challenge for us. The VOCs, we're looking at part per billion levels, where the odors, we were looking at more part per trillion levels. So again, the idea, can we combine these 2 methods into one using SPME and a single GC column? So for the chromatography, I want to quickly just go over this. I know I haven't spent too much time on the chromatographic conditions today, but you can always reach out if you have more questions about this. But using SIM mode for our VOCs and odors, we were able to get good separation of all of our analytes of interest using a SIM mass spec method. And we can see here our low-level analytes, compounds number 28 and 29, are our 2-methyl isoborneol, and also 29 is geosmin. These are our analytes of interest, or our odors of interest at much lower levels, and you can see that they're separated out nicely, but also able to be combined with the VOC method. So for sample preparation, we added 1.5 grams of sodium chloride to a 20 ml headspace vial, which was then topped up with 4.98 mils of water and spiked with 20 microliters of our VOCs and odors standard. We also used a set of internal standards for this method. Our calibration looked over a 9-point range for each of these. Again, the calibration ranges were very different for the VOCs and for the odors, based on the values or the permissible limits for the VOCs as well as the permissible limits for the odors. And then for our instrument detection limit and method verification, we looked at 7 replicate injections. VOCs, we looked at 0.2 and 2 nanograms per mil. And then for the odors, we looked at 0.004 nanograms per mil. So here you can see our method verification table. You'll note that some of these compounds have different calibration ranges. And again, that's due to analyte saturation, which is something that I mentioned early on. So each of these analytes are going to extract at much different rates. So again, for dichloromethane, this range is much different compared to, chloroethene. But still, even with the adjusted concentration ranges, it still met our needs for the permissible limits of each of these in the drinking water. And then you'll see for our methyl isoborneol and our geosmin, we had much lower levels for these compounds due to the aroma sensitivity of these compounds in drinking water. We were able to achieve good R-squared values for each of these, for the calibrations, and more importantly, we were able to achieve very good percent residual standard errors for these compounds when looking at their calibrations. So we were able to achieve, for many compounds, within 10% residual standard error, with only a few falling outside of that 10%, like dichloromethane, as well as 1,4-dioxane, which can be a problematic compound to begin with. Our LOQs achieved were very good and within the limits that we needed for each compound. And then again, we had very good method precision with all percent RSDs falling at or within or under 15% RSD, which was very good. So just to quickly summarize this method, we were able to combine 2 methods into one using an optimized GC phase. We also used a SPME carbon wide range phase coding to extract our analytes of interest. And this proved to work very well for both the VOCs and the odors. And then we accommodated the different calibration ranges, which we knew was going to be our biggest hurdle for this method, with the VOCs being at mid to low ppb levels and the odors being at part per trillion levels.